Karen spent 6 straight months flicking her cigarette butts onto my driveway, always insisting the wind carry them there. But when I eventually gathered more than 5,000 of those discarded filters and used them to clog her pool's filtration system, she finally learned that I was not just another annoyed homeowner. I was an environmental engineer whose entire career revolved around documenting contamination and proving exactly who caused it. My name is Edward, and I work as an environmental compliance engineer for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality in Houston. For the past 14 years, I have investigated pollution violations, traced contamination back to its source, and built airtight cases against individuals and corporations that harm the environment. My work demands extreme attention to detail, careful scientific analysis, and almost endless amount of patience. What Karen failed to realize when she turned my property into her personal ashtray was that she had chosen the worst possible neighbor to pollute. She was dumping waste on the land of someone professionally trained to identify contamination sources and hold polluters accountable under the law. I live in Meadowbrook Estates, a subdivision built in 2013 on the north side of Houston. The neighborhood consists of comfortable, middle-class homes with modest yards and attached garages. The Homeowners Association manages the common landscaping and maintains a shared community pool. For 7 years, the neighborhood was quiet and cooperative, and neighbors generally respected one another's property. That changed when Karen moved into the house directly next to mine. She arrived about 10 months ago, with perfectly styled golden blonde hair and an attitude that made it clear she believed rules applied to everyone except her. She had no interest in joining the HOA board or participating in neighborhood governance. Her only priority was doing whatever she pleased without facing consequences. Karen was a heavy smoker. She smoked on her front porch, in her driveway, beside her mailbox, and throughout her backyard. Smoking itself was not the issue. People are free to smoke on their own property. The real problem was that Karen refused to use an ashtray or dispose of her cigarette butts properly. Instead, she flicked them onto the ground wherever she happened to be standing. Within 2 weeks of her moving in, I began finding cigarette butts scattered across my driveway, lawn, flower beds, and walkway. They accumulated quickly. 5 or 6 new butts every single day. After the first week, I knocked on her door. She answered while holding a lit cigarette. I explained calmly, "Karen, cigarette butts keep appearing on my property. They're coming from your direction. Could you please use an ashtray?" She casually blew smoke to the side and replied, "The wind probably carries them. I can't control the wind." I pointed out that the wind does not deposit cigarette butts in a straight line onto my driveway every single day and asked again that she dispose of them properly. "I'll think about it," she said, then shut the door. Nothing changed. The cigarette butts continued to appear daily. After another week, I knocked again. I told her the littering was still happening and needed to stop. She shrugged and said, "Like I told you, it's the wind, not my problem." I replied that it was absolutely her problem because they were her cigarette butts and asked her politely to stop littering on my property. She smiled and said, "Prove they're mine," before closing the door again. That single sentence changed everything. Karen wanted proof. Proving contamination sources was literally my profession. Challenge accepted. I began documenting every single incident. Each cigarette butt that appeared on my property was collected, photographed with precise location markers, and sealed in labeled evidence bags with dates and times recorded. I installed a security camera aimed directly at the property line between our houses. Within 3 days, I captured clear video footage of Karen standing in her driveway, smoking and deliberately flicking the butt toward my property. She did this repeatedly throughout the day, morning, afternoon, and evening. Sometimes the butts landed on my driveway, sometimes in my grass. She did not care where they landed, as long as they were no longer on her side. I collected every single but for 6 months, cataloging and storing them in sealed containers organized by date. Karen smoked at least a pack a day, and roughly 70% of those butts ended up on my property. By the end of 6 months, I had collected just over 5,000 cigarette butts. During this time, I also researched the legal and environmental implications. Cigarette butts are not harmless litter. They contain toxic substances, such as arsenic, lead, and nicotine that leach into soil and groundwater. In many contexts, they are classified as hazardous waste. Deliberately disposing of them on someone else's property qualifies as illegal dumping. I first contacted the HOA, submitting a formal complaint complete with photographs and video evidence. The property manager, a reasonable woman named Sandra, was appalled. She told me this behavior was completely unacceptable and issued Karen a violation notice immediately. Karen received a $500 fine, and in order to stop littering on neighboring properties, she ignored it entirely. The cigarette butts kept coming. Sandra sent another notice with a higher fine. Karen paid it, but changed nothing. In fact, she escalated her behavior, deliberately flicking cigarette butts toward my property whenever she saw me outside, smiling while she did it. I then filed a complaint with the City of Houston's Code Enforcement Department for illegal dumping. An inspector reviewed my documentation and issued Karen a citation with a $200 fine. Karen paid that as well and continued littering without hesitation. She treated the fines as a fee that allowed her to keep polluting my property. It was clear she had enough disposable income that small fines meant nothing to her. I needed a different strategy. Karen had an above-ground pool in her backyard, roughly 15 feet in diameter, with a standard filtration and circulation system that I could see clearly from my second-floor window. She used the pool frequently during the summer and was meticulous about keeping the water clean and the filtration system running perfectly. That was when the idea formed. Cigarette filters are made from cellulose acetate, a form of plastic that does not biodegrade easily. Introducing thousands of cigarette butts into a pool filtration system can clog the filter media, block circulation lines, and cause complete system failure. The nicotine and other chemicals contaminate the water, making it unsafe and requiring extensive remediation. I had no intention of damaging her pool equipment. I was simply going to return her property to her in a way that clearly demonstrated the consequences of her actions. The consequences of her actions. One Saturday evening, when Karen was away, I watched her pull out of her driveway around 6 p.m. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I retrieved all 5,000 cigarette butts I had accumulated over the previous 6 months. They were stored in 10 large sealed containers, carefully organized and fully documented. I walked into her backyard, where her pool system was running, the filtration unit humming steadily. I located the pool skimmer and slowly poured every single cigarette butt into the intake, where they would be drawn directly into filtration system. All 5,000 cigarette butts vanished into her pool system in less than 10 minutes. I returned to my house, double-checked that my security cameras were recording, and waited. Sunday morning around 9 a.m., I heard screaming coming from Karen's backyard. I looked out my window and saw her standing beside the pool, staring in disbelief at water that had turned cloudy and brown. The filtration system was making grinding, strained noises before shutting itself off completely. She immediately called a pool service company. The technician arrived within 2 hours. From my window, I watched him open the filter housing and begin pulling out cigarette butts. Hundreds of them. They had completely clogged the filter media and jammed the circulation pump. He worked for more than 3 hours, removing cigarette butts from every part of the filtration system. Karen stood there watching, her face growing redder by the minute. When he finished, I saw him speaking to her and gesturing toward a massive pile of cigarette butts he had removed. Even from my window, the pile was impossible to miss. 5,000 cigarette butts make a very clear statement. Karen slowly turned and looked toward my house. I was standing at the window with my arms crossed, watching. She knew exactly where those cigarette butts had come from. The technician's truck pulled away around 1 p.m. 10 minutes later. Karen was pounding on my front door. I opened it with my phone recording. "You dumped cigarettes in my pool," she screamed. I calmly replied, "I returned your property to you. Those are the 5,000 cigarette butts you threw onto my property over the last 6 months. I collected every one, documented them with photos and dates, and returned them to their owner." She yelled that I had vandalized her pool system. I told her I had vandalized nothing. Cigarette butts are classified as solid waste, and she had been illegally dumping them on my property despite repeated warnings, HOA fines, and city citations. I explained that I simply returned what belonged to her. She shouted that she was calling the police. I told her to please do so. I explained that I had 6 months of documentation showing her illegal dumping, video footage of her deliberately flicking cigarettes onto my property, copies of HOA violations she ignored, city citations for illegal dumping, and video of me collecting cigarette butts from my own property and returning them to their source. I added that I had not trespassed because I accessed her backyard to the common area fence line, which is technically HOA property. That part was a slight stretch, but Karen did not know enough property law to challenge it. She stood there breathing heavily, clearly trying to decide her next move. I calmly asked how much the pool repair had cost. $800, she shouted. I nodded and said, interesting. I've paid over $1,200 in landscaping repairs where your cigarette butts kill my plants through chemical contamination. I've spent 40 hours of my own time collecting your trash, and I filed 3 formal complaints that you ignored. Consider this a lesson in consequences. Karen turned around and stormed back to her house without saying another word. She did call the police. An officer arrived about 20 minutes later and spoke with both of us. I presented my documentation. 6 months of collected evidence, video footage of Karen littering, HOA violations, city citations, and proof that I had simply returned waste that originated from her property. The officer reviewed everything, then looked at Karen and said, "Ma'am, he returned items that you discarded onto his property. While the method was unusual, it does not constitute vandalism or criminal mischief. You were cited multiple times for illegal dumping and continued behavior. I suggest you use an ashtray going forward." He left without filing any charges. Monday morning, I received a letter from Karen's attorney threatening legal action for property damage. I forwarded it to my attorney, Michelle, who specializes in environmental law. Michelle sent back a detailed response outlining my documentation of Karen's illegal dumping, the environmental contamination she caused, and the legal justification for returning improperly disposed waste to its source. She also stated that I was prepared to file a civil lawsuit for landscaping damage, time spent collecting hazardous waste, and ongoing contamination remediation. Karen's attorney never replied, and no lawsuit was filed. The cigarette butt stopped appearing on my property immediately. Karen began using a large ashtray on her porch, and I never found another cigarette butt on my lawn. 2 months later, she listed her house for sale and moved out within 6 weeks. I later heard she bought a downtown condo, where she would not have neighbors with adjacent yards. The family who moved in afterward is wonderful, a young couple with a toddler. Neither of them smoke, and they keep their property spotless. I still keep all the documentation from the 6-month cigarette collection in my home office. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the best response to someone who refuses to respect boundaries is to return the situation to them in a way they cannot ignore. My flower beds recovered after I replaced the contaminated soil. Chemical analysis confirmed elevated nicotine and heavy metal levels where the cigarette butts had accumulated, proving the environmental damage Karen caused. I later used the case as an example in a presentation at a regional environmental compliance conference titled Small-Scale Contamination, Documenting and Addressing Residential Pollution Sources. My colleagues found it both educational and hilarious. The HOA updated its rules to explicitly prohibit cigarette butt littering and any other waste being dumped onto neighboring properties, with escalating fines for repeat offenders. Sandra later told me my documentation, and persistence helped them strengthen enforcement procedures. I still work for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, investigating pollution cases across the state. But every time I pass a pool supply store, I smile, remembering Karen's face when that technician started pulling 5,000 cigarette butts out of her filter system. If you've ever dealt with a neighbor who refused to stop littering on your property, or someone who believed fines didn't matter, share your story in the comments. Send this to anyone who needs creative inspiration for dealing with people who refuse to respect boundaries. And subscribe for more stories about using professional expertise to solve personal problems. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about anger. It's about returning someone's mess in a way that makes the consequences impossible to ignore.